war. Oh, thank you. So, and you can press the touch. Got it, Sandy. So, so welcome everybody. We're approaching the 50th year of the Center for Marxist Education, and I think all of us have a sense of that capitalism is in one of its periodic general failures, except that it's on steroids. And the threat to humanity is clear, but another side to this is that it's precisely when an old system is suffering general failures that the doors open for a new social system. And Marxism is absolutely crucial to navigate through this, as Lenin's direction, starting in particular, well, decades before World War I, but starting in particular with the World War, and then through the ups and downs of the year 1917, and many even in the Bolshevik Party, which numbered just 8,000 at the start of 1917, but in terms of providing guidance through unparalleled challenges. But by in November of 1917, this party was in power. And we see the same thing, say, with the extraordinary leadership of a communist party, say, in Yugoslavia through World War II, often ignored, but extraordinary considering how capitalism had inflamed national entities for decades, really longer than that, in the Balkans, and to overcome that and lead a revolution, in many ways very similar to China, but on a small scale. And then again, same with the extraordinary achievements of the Communist Party and leadership in China. And this will come up in today's session. In any event, so if humanity needs Marxism and the working class to put it into action and lead to liberation. But today covers some very serious defeats that have set the stage for further defeats, including, in my opinion, the fall of the Soviet Union itself, but also defeats, for example, of what should have been the socialist revolution in Iran, where my parents ended up in their endless travels. So, but let me start really, one, to thank Zach, but also to thank Yusuf for proposing this presentation and all the work that Yusuf's been doing to advance education and Marxism, including bringing historical and linguistic depth to our discussions. Zach has been doing the same and leading the film series since Richard Pendleton got very ill 4 years ago. Richard is doing much better, and although he's in a group home, we're hoping he can come back and that the CME will gain immensely from having both Richard and Zach. So let me tell you a little bit about me personally. I was born in Jaffa, called in the West, I guess, Jaffa, in 1946. And I was driven out along with 95% or more of Jaffa's population in 1948, in what was the second of 3 ethnic cleansings that were needed to create the Israeli state. The first was ethnic cleansing of Jews from Europe, including deliberate cleansing by the US Army of Jews and displaced persons under its, that the US Army ran those displaced person camps and forced them to go to Palestine, even though the majority did not want to go. The third ethnic cleansing actually was of Jews in Arab countries, where in the years after the formation of the Israeli state, essentially the Zionists and imperialists behind them provoked ethnic cleansing of Jews living in Arab countries, for example, by bombing synagogues in Iraq, Morocco, and elsewhere. And it was throwing match into gasoline filled room. So we first fled to Gaza. I was too young to remember it. For some reason, my mother hung on to a blanket we were issued there for the rest of her life. I don't know why. No quality blanket. From Gaza, then we moved to Alexandria, Egypt. My father had training in public health and in pharmacy, and he got work there. He had to get a work permit. We then moved to Cairo, and we were forced out of Egypt in 1958 when the government denied all Palestinians work permits. And we moved to Lebanon just in time for a civil war with the U.S. Marines there, 1958. Later in 1958, we moved again to the United States, but my parents soon returned to Iran, first to Lebanon and then to Iran. My father was imprisoned by the Shah's forces, maybe in retaliation for what I was doing here. That was about a year before revolution broke out in Iran. After he was released, he got work in the Saudi state before finally retiring, and he came to the U.S. So some terminology that you may find interesting that I think is important. I think it's wrong to refer to Israel, quote unquote, as if it's a legitimate country. It's not. It's a recent and doomed creation of imperialism. The entire area, including what's referred to sometimes as Israel, is occupied Palestine. There is an Israeli state, meaning a body of armed men with both regular armed forces and a KKK of settlers, which the state arms and trains. And the U.S. and respectable people in the U.S. have long funded and continued to fund and arm the state and these KKK settlers. And the donations to them are tax deductible. The formal amount of U.S. aid to the Israeli state is said to be $3.8 billion a year for arms. The likely real amount is probably close to 20 billion. But this is an illegitimate, doomed death trap created by imperialism, unfortunately, with critical support from leaders of the Soviet Union and part of a world communist movement, including some leaders of a communist party in Palestine. So Soviet leaders reversed the Lenin and the Comintern's history of opposition to creating this apartheid entity. But they ended up, including leaders of the Communist Party in Palestine, they ended up helping arm and train Zionist bands at a crucial time, 1947-48. Without that arming, including of warplanes, the Israeli state may not have been created. So, and this was a serious error that proved to be a factor in the fall of the Soviet Union. And hopefully this will follow this will come up in discussion. So also terminological, I object to using anti-Semitism to mean anti-Jewish chauvinism. So that anti-Jewish chauvinism is a real sickness, and we have to fight it tooth and nail, as will all chauvinism and ignorance, most importantly, including within the ranks of the workers' movement. But the use of anti-Semitism to refer to anti-Jewish chauvinism is anti-Semitic. How so? More than 90% of Semitic speakers are Arabs. Arabic is a Semitic language. Zionist revival of Hebrew was done to divide Jews from Arabs with some effectiveness. And I believe it's the only dead language to have been revived and last. So, so some of the basic lessons I've learned, I'll sum them up before going to some of the sequence. Or I'm trying to think, Zach, do you think it'd be better to go to the documentary?
Yes, we could start it now.
Yeah, we can do that. And if you find it too slow, we can stop it at some point. It is interesting, but we can stop it and return to the presentation and the discussion.
Okay, I'll get it started.
Yeah, sorry about that. Let's try that.
Okay.
May 15th, 1967. A parade of military might to celebrate 19 years since the founding of the State of Israel. But this public display of power took place under a dark shadow. The previous day, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had ordered his forces to take up positions along the borders with Israel.
اللي كنا واثقين منه الموضوع هيحصل وانها تقوم معركة بسيطة ضعيفة ضد عدو ضعيف بسرعة جدا هنكون في تل أبيب.
3 weeks later, on the 5th of June 1967, Israel launched an all-out war against its Arab neighbors. After only 6 days of fighting, it achieved total victory, defeating the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria.
וכך מלחמת ששת הימים, שנחשבת לאיזה מין אירוע צבאי חשוב בהיסטוריה הצבאית, בעצם לא הייתה מלחמה. זה היה מרדף באש חיה מול אויב בורח ולא נלחם.
Known to Israelis as the Six-Day War, Israel's territorial gains would change the map of the Middle East. To this day, Israeli occupation of these lands is the main bar to peace in this turbulent region.
These huge territories which the Israeli army had conquered, it completely intoxicated them. Everybody was intoxicated. No one could even think straight.
But the story of this war is much longer than the 6 days of fighting. Its roots lay years earlier. 2 decades before the 5th of June, 1967. Tel Aviv, the 14th of May, 1948. The day that Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel.
إسرائيل كانت تعلم يقيناً أن العرب سيعملون جاهدين على أنهم يرتفعوا بقدراتهم العسكرية أساساً حتى يستردوا ما أخذته إسرائيل منهم بالقوة السلاح.
On the day after the declaration, 5 Arab armies entered Palestine. The Lebanese attacked from the north, the Syrians, Iraqis, and Jordanians from the east. But the most serious threat came from the south.
The Egyptian army advanced to the village of Yibna, which is 22 kilometers from Tel Aviv. We were a very thin line of soldiers who were defending what was practically the last line of defense of Tel Aviv.
But the pressure on the Israelis was relieved when a UN brokered truce came into effect.
The Zionist movement purchased arms on the European black markets. The Arab armies, of course, enjoyed mainstream supplies from states. The French supplied the Lebanese and the Syrians. The British supplied the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Iraqis with a constant stream of arms. In 1948, the United Nations imposed an embargo on arms shipments to the Middle East, and the British and the French abided by this embargo.
When the truce ran out, the Israelis, now better armed, set out to expel the Arab armies from Palestine.
حرب 48 الأعمال العسكرية الكبرى كانت ضد القوات المصرية لأن الجبهة المصرية كانت تشكل لهم خطرا كبيرا. الجبهة المصرية كانت هي الجبهة الأهم بالنسبة للجبهات العربية أو بما يسمى دول الطوق.
By the end of October, as Israeli troops advanced, an Egyptian brigade was encircled at a Palestinian village called Al-Fallujah. Among the officers trapped in this pocket was a young major, Gamal Abdel Nasser. With their armies locked in a stalemate, Egyptian and Israeli delegations met on the island of Rhodes under the sponsorship of the UN. After a month of bargaining, they reached an armistice agreement.
Well, first of all, they had to put an end to the fighting. I believe that Egypt wanted to get out of there as much as Israel wanted. And the negotiation was mostly about evacuating the Fallujah pocket. Egypt had no territorial demands from Israel. So it was relatively easy to reach a ceasefire.
By the summer of 1949, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria had also signed armistice agreements with Israel. The Jewish state now extended over almost the whole of Palestine. Arab territory was reduced to just a few small enclaves. Eastern Jerusalem and the West Bank were placed under Jordanian control. The Gaza Strip was to be administered by Egypt. In the midst of defeat, Gamal Abdel Nasser conceived a plan that would change the future of Egypt. a movement that would be known as the Free Officers.
كان في كثير من الضباط الأحرار موجودين في 48 وهم في الحرب أدركوا اللعبة اللي اتلعبت بيهم، أدركوا أن دخولهم المعركة كان على غير استعداد، وأن هذه مسألة ارتكبت في الدوائر السياسية المصرية، وعشان كده هم قرروا أن يقفوا ضد الاستعمار والقوى المساندة له وفي مقدمتها السراي.
3 years after the end of the war, the Free Officers struck. In July 1952, they launched a coup d'etat. Egypt's King Farouk was dethroned and sent into exile. Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, the mastermind behind what was now called the July Revolution, quickly rose to be the country's de facto leader. In Israel, this news aroused deep-rooted fears in Kibbutz Sde Boker, retirement home of Israel's founding Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion.
Ben-Gurion all the time feared that one day a new Kemal Atatürk would rise in the Arab world and will unite the entire Arab world against Israel. And that fear, that apprehension, was enhanced when Nasser took power in 1954.
In February 1955, Ben-Gurion returned to political life, this time as defense minister. Just a week after Ben-Gurion took up the post, 150 Israeli paratroopers, led by Major Ariel Sharon, were sent to attack an Egyptian army base near the city of Gaza. 40 Egyptian soldiers were killed and many more injured.
When Ben-Gurion came back, he decided immediately to show that Israel is not going to give in. This time, from the Egyptian border, the provocations and the attacks by infiltrators were on the rise.
أتى عبد الناصر بعد أيام، وبالتحديد في أوائل مارس 1955، واجتمع بكبار رجال المدينة ورؤسائها، وأقسم بأن هذا الاعتداء لن ينساه، وأن هذا الاعتداء لابد من الرد عليه.
Claiming they were Egyptian territorial waters, Nasser closed the Tiran Strait at the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba to ships sailing to and from the Israeli port of Eilat. To strengthen his army, Nasser sought more weapons from the west, but this time to no avail. So in a surprise move, he turned east.
Russia's new foreign minister, Mr. Shapilov, lost no time in taking a personal part in Middle East affairs, and he was soon engaged in talks with President Nasser.
Egypt signed this huge arms deal with Czechoslovakia, which was actually with the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia was supposed to supply Egypt with 200 aircraft, tanks, 1,000 cannon. It was something fabulous.
In November 1955, Ben-Gurion began a second term as Israel's prime minister. At the top of his agenda was how to respond to the growing strength of Egypt, now armed to the teeth. Eight months later, the opportunity came when Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal. A decision that outraged the British and French, the owners of the International Canal Company.
This is a matter of life and death to us all. Our quarrel is not with Egypt, still less with the Arab world. It is with Colonel Nasser. He has shown that he's not a man who can be trusted to keep an agreement.
Britain and France were convinced that military intervention would be needed to recapture the canal and bring down the upstart Nasser. But a pretext was needed.
فرنسا على لسان بينو وزير الخارجية اقترح انه اسرائيل تدخل معهم كعامل مساعد لإعطائهم الذريعة للتدخل على أساس أنهم هيطلبوا من كلا الطرفين المتحاربين التحرك لمسافة 10 أميال على جانبي قناة السويس. إسرائيل بالقطع كانت هتقبل ومصر سترفض، فتعطي الذريعة لإنجلترا وفرنسا أنهم يعلنوا الحرب عليها.
According to this tripartite secret agreement, on the 29th of October, 1956, Israeli forces crossed the border into Egypt. Even though the Israelis were still some distance from the canal, Britain and France called for both sides to withdraw. When Nasser rejected the ultimatum, British and French troops began landing in Port Said, at the Mediterranean end of the canal.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, with no veto operating, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
By the end of December, under heavy international pressure, the British and French were forced into a humiliating withdrawal from Port Said. Global attention now shifted to Israel, still occupying the whole of the Sinai and the Gaza Strip.
رئيس ايزنهاور اتصل ببن غوريون وقال له انسحب من سيناء. فكان الرد: يا سيد الرئيس، لو اعلنت في الكنيست صباحا ان انا قررت الانسحاب فسوف تسقط الوزاره بعد الظهر. فقال له: هذه مشكلتك وعليك حلها.
In March 1957, Ben-Gurion finally ordered the Israeli army to withdraw to the pre-war borders. However, he had secured two major gains. The stationing of UN troops along the borders with Egypt and Gaza put an end to the Palestinian Fedayeen's raids inside Israeli territories. And Israel was guaranteed free passage of her shipping through the Tiran Strait.
The Sinai campaign gave Israel actually about 10 years of unsigned peace. On the Egyptian border between 1957 and 1967, there was a total calm.
But the fragile peace on the borders masked continuing hostility between Cairo and Tel Aviv. In Israel, Ezer Weizmann, the commander of the Air Force, was devising a new strategy. Operation Focus.
האמת היא שהתאמנו למבצע מוקד שנים לא מעטות לפני הביצוע עצמו. הקונספט היה שאנחנו תוקפים את המסלולים ומוצאים אותם משימוש, ולאחר מכן מתארגנים לצליפה ויורים במטוסים הפזורים בשדה.
But two things threatened to derail that plan. The first was Egypt's highly versatile Soviet-made air defenses. This network would soon face its first major test. Not, though, at the hands of Weizmann's Air Force, but through the bizarre actions of an Israeli peace activist.
Ibn Natan was a commercial pilot, and as a gimmick for the elections of 1965, he bought a little airplane, painted it white and put the name Peace, and said, if I'm elected to the Knesset, I will fly to Egypt. He was not elected. A very small number of people voted for him. But by that time, he became very serious of this. So one day, without any announcement, he took off with this plane.
Abi Natan landed in Port Said, Egypt, in February 1966.
وصل القناة ازاي؟ ونزل المطار ازاي؟ وفين الدفاع الجوي؟ وفين الرادارات؟ وفين الطيران؟
Furthermore, Natan asked to meet President Nasser to deliver a petition calling for peace.
Egyptians treated him very nicely. They did not let him into Egypt, but they let him fill his tank with gasoline and sent him back.
Natan's flight had revealed the weakness of Egypt's air defenses. But Israel still had a major concern. The MiG-21, a high-performance supersonic Soviet fighter. It formed the backbone of the Arab air forces. But it too would soon give up its secrets. In August 1966, an Iraqi pilot landed in Israel with his MiG. He had been offered $1 million to defect, but it would turn out to be worth every cent.
Danny Shapira, our chief test pilot of the Air Force, checked the aeroplane, and we knew all its disadvantages of the MiG-21, which was the aeroplane of the war in the enemy hands.
It was not long before what the Israelis had learned about the MiG was put to the test in actual combat. In April 1967, the border skirmishes with Syria escalated into a full-scale aerial battle.
We shot down 7 aircraft. It was such a victory in the Israeli Air Force.
In the weeks following this battle, reports, possibly originating with Soviet intelligence, began to come in that Israel was massing its army on the Syrian border. An apparent escalation that spurred Nasser into action. On the 14th of May, 1967, he ordered Egyptian troops into Sinai.
مصر دخلت هذه الحرب وليس في نيتها الهجوم، وإنه مجرد إن 130 ألف عسكري تواجدوا في سيناء هيخلق شيء من الردع لإسرائيل من إنها تقوم بعمل مسلح أو تحاول إنها تغزو أو تهاجم سوريا.
But Nasser also saw an opportunity to try to roll back the gains Israel had secured following the 1956 war. On the 16th of May, Egypt asked the UN to withdraw its peacekeeping troops from Sinai. A week later, in the theatrical setting of a meeting with his fighter pilots, Nasser announced the closing of the Tiran Strait to Israeli shipping. News of Nasser's actions brought people out onto the streets, all across the Arab world.
حصلت حمية عربية في هذه المرحلة. إسرائيل استغلتها تماما سياسيا وإعلاميا إنها معرضة إلى الفناء، وبالتالي ادت نفسها المبرر لشن الضربة الاستباقية أو الضربة الإجهاضية لحماية نفسها.
Israel's new war cabinet under Levi Eshkol took the decision to open hostilities on the 5th of June, 1967. The Air Force was given the green light to launch Operation Focus, the aerial attack it had been rehearsing for years. The Israelis had rolled the dice, which would determine the future of their state. Cairo, the morning of Monday, the 5th of June, 1967. A day that will change the history of the Middle East. A plane is waiting to take off towards Sinai. Marshal Abdel Hakim Amr, Deputy Supreme Commander of the Egyptian Armed Forces, is making a morale-boosting visit to troops deployed on the borders with Israel for the last 3 weeks.
هي العملية كانت واخدة شكل مظاهرة عسكرية قد تصل إلى أنه تتحل سياسيا ودبلوماسيا، ويبقى احنا طلعنا من العملية دي بالكامل بأن احنا حرمنا إسرائيل من المرور في مضيق تيران.
But this Egyptian show of strength was put to good use by Israeli media. Memories of the Holocaust were invoked to persuade Israelis they were facing a threat to their very existence.
The Egyptians were the Nazis. Gamal Abdel Nasser was never mentioned by name in the Hebrew media at the time. He was called the Egyptian tyrant. That was his name.
In Washington, US President Lyndon B. Johnson issued a stark warning to whichever side should start the war. It was a thinly veiled threat to the Egyptian leadership.
اجتمعوا عدة اجتماعات حضرها الرئيس جمال عبد الناصر. قال لك طيب لو سمحنا لإسرائيل بأنها تقوم بالضربة الأولى، فقائد القوات الجوية اعترض وقال أنا لا أقبل هذا الموضوع. فقالوا له هل تفضل إن احنا نقوم بالضربة الأولى ونحارب أمريكا وإسرائيل، أم نتلقى الضربة الأولى ونحارب إسرائيل فقط؟
In fact, Israel, though apparently the underdog, was far more prepared for war than any of its Arab opponents. Israeli Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin toured the front line to meet troops waiting for a green light.
Under this action of Nasser, Israel had to mobilize all its forces, all its reserve forces, and also to think that we should strike first. And the striking first was, in the eyes of Israeli, a reaction to what we thought are aggressive action of the Egyptian side.
The opening attack would be the much-rehearsed Operation Focus. An aerial strike to destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. In the early hours of the 5th of June, 1967, the Israeli Air Force prepared to deliver the first blow.
When we wake up in the morning and came to the briefing room, we wrote on the blackboard the hours, which was 7:45.
"200 Israeli jets took to the air. They would arrive over Egyptian airfields at exactly 7:45 a.m. To avoid radar detection, they flew first north, then west over the Mediterranean. Turning south, the planes came in from the north, not from the east, as the Egyptians had anticipated.
طائرتين جايين من بعيد لونهم غامق قوي كده، ويا دوبك احنا ركزنا فيهم كانت القنابل بتنزل على الممر. وطخ طخ طخ وبقيت الويف بقى.
Now everything is very easy, as you trained many times before. His aircraft were located very easy on the ground and not far from the runways. It was not a big problem to strike them. Immediately, you saw big torches with smoke over all those airfields.
جريت ولمحت خندق نطيت فيه لقيت لايرز من البشر جوه الخندق، اخرهم واحد كان استاذي في السرب، فقلت له الموضوع انتهى خلاص. قال لي عيب ما تقولش كده، بلاش الانهزاميه دي. قلت له انهزاميه ايه؟ هل يعقل ان احنا بس اللي بنضرب؟ طبعا كله بيتضرب في وقت واحد دلوقتي.
By midday, the Israelis had successfully attacked 18 airfields. The Egyptians had lost 80% of their air force. More than 300 planes destroyed on the ground.
الطيارات بتاعتنا كانت مرصوصة في المطارات زي مطار زيورخ. مفيش تجهيز هندسي اللي دشم للطائرات، مفيش دفاع جوي قوي، مفيش رادارات قوية تكشف الضربة الجوية اللي خلصت على الدفاع الجوي والطيران في ساعتين.
Ironically, Cairo radio was carrying false reports of the total failure of the enemy's air attack. With news coming in of Egypt's apparent success, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq now launched their own airstrikes.
אני זוכר שביום הראשון, נדמה לי זה היה הראשון או השני, ראינו מטוסי הנטר ירדנים תוקפים את שדה התעופה של סירקין. זה היה שדה לא פעיל. אבל היו שם איזה מטוס נורד אחד, אם אני לא טועה, ומטוסי דמה. ולא הבנו למה.
Ineffective though they were, Those attacks gave the Israelis a pretext to widen the scope of the war. Operation Focus was extended to cover airfields in Jordan, Syria, and even a key base in Iraq.
H3 was the only base from which they could reach Israel, and the only base in which we could reach with the last drops of the fuel.
My third flight that day, I attacked El Maza Air Base, not far from Damascus. When I made my first turn over the city of Damascus, people climbed on the roofs and waved for us, the people in Damascus.
Caught off guard, the Syrians lost half their aircraft. The H3 airfield in Iraq was put out of action, and Jordan's air force was totally destroyed. By sunset on the first day of war, Operation Focus had guaranteed Israel total air superiority in the skies over the Middle East. The Arab armies would now be fighting with no air support. The outcome of the war had been sealed.
I really think that there is no example in the history of world aviation of such a total strike and a total attack. Maybe the only time that you can compare it is Pearl Harbor, the attack of the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, which was also a great surprise attack, which almost decimated the American fleet in the Pacific.
On the ground, though, Egyptian forces were faring much better. They had succeeded in holding up the Israeli armored advance into Sinai. Yet the Egyptian Deputy Supreme Commander, Marshal Amr, was about to take a disastrous decision. Its roots lay in his attempted visit to the front line the day before.
מטוסים ישראלים טסו מעל שדה התעופה ביר גפגפה שבסיני, באותו זמן עצמו טס מטוס מצרי קל עם סגן נשיא מצרים, המרשל עמר, וכל המטה הכללי המצרי. ופתאום, בהפתעה, הם מצאו את עצמם מוקפים במטוסי קרב ישראלים.
Miraculously, the plane was able to return to Cairo. But Marshal Amr had been shocked by witnessing Israel's air supremacy at first hand. The next day, Amr ordered an immediate withdrawal of Egyptian troops from Sinai. An order which led to the total collapse of the Egyptian front.
וכך מלחמת ששת הימים, שנחשבת לאיזה מין אירוע צבאי חשוב בהיסטוריה הצבאית, בעצם לא הייתה מלחמה. זה היה מרדף באש חיה מול אויב בורח ולא נלחם. ואחרי המלחמה, כיוון שההישג היה עצום, החליטו להסתיר את כל הכישלונות, להסתיר את כל הבעיות, ולפרסם סיפור שהניצחון היה בגלל שצה"ל הוא אחד הצבאות הטובים בהיסטוריה, ומפקדי צה"ל הם גאונים שכמוהם אולי לא היו בכלל בהיסטוריה.
By the fourth day of the war, Israeli troops reached the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. They had occupied the whole of the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip.
احنا ظلمنا في هذا الحرب كعسكريين، لم نقاتل، جيش مصر لم يقاتل، نفذ أوامر الانسحاب واتبهدل في عملية الانسحاب، وشلنا وتحملنا عن قيادة السعار هذه الهزيمة، فكانت جبال حزن رهيبة جدا.
The previous day, the Israelis had also tasted success on their eastern front, ending the short-lived war launched by Jordan's King Hussein.
By 11 o'clock in the morning, the first day, virtually after we destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, but Hussein didn't know it at that time. On the contrary, Nasser called him up and said, we're winning, do your own share. He didn't do a big offensive, he was unable to do it, but he conquered the hill around the government house. It endangered the southern part of Jerusalem. His forces were only by now a few hundred yards away from Israeli houses of Israeli citizens.
On the afternoon of the first day of the war, the Israelis began their assault against the Jordanians. The battle soon escalated, and 2 days later, the whole of the West Bank and Jerusalem fell to the Israelis.
מפקדים הירדנים ראו שהמצרים נסוגים, ובכל אופן לא מתקיפים ולא פועלים, אז הם החליטו להעביר את שתי חטיבות השריון הירדניות ממזרח לנהר הירדן. וכך לא הייתה שום בעיה גם לכבוש את כל יהודה ושומרון.
With the war all but over on the Egyptian and Jordanian fronts, and ignoring a UN call for a ceasefire, Israel's high command now decided to secure its borders with Syria. On the fifth day of war, Israeli troops began to climb the strategic Golan Heights.
أنا كنت عام 67 ضابط في الجيش اللبناني برتبة ملازم، وكنت على الحدود الجنوبية للبنان مقابل الجولان. يعني حضرت معركة 67 كأنني أحضر على مسرح. أذكر تماما أن خلافا لما ذكر يعني أن الجيش السوري قاوم فعلا، حصلت مقاومة سورية شرسة جدا.
But on the sixth day of the war, Damascus radio made an unexpected announcement. Syria had accepted the UN ceasefire. With no advance warning given to troops fighting on the Golan, the broadcast fatally undermined Syrian army resistance. The man blamed for the army's collapse was the Minister of Defense, a man who would eventually rise to power in Syria, Hafez al-Assad. The Israelis pushed on and occupied the whole of the Golan Heights.
لم يكن خطأ الضباط السوريين، كان خطأ القيادة السياسية التي أعلنت في ذلك الوقت وقف إطلاق النار بالإذاعة بالراديو قبل أن يتبلغه الجنود.
At the end of the sixth day of fighting, and only when it had achieved all its goals, Israel accepted the UN ceasefire. The guns fell silent. The Arabs had suffered a humiliating defeat.
وبرغم أية عوامل قد أكون بنيت عليها موقفي في الأزمة، فإنني على استعداد لتحمل المسؤولية كلها، ولقد اتخذت قراراً أريدكم جميعاً أن تساعدوني عليه. لقد قررت أن أتنحى تماماً ونهائياً عن أي منصب رسمي وأي دور سياسي، وأن أعود إلى صفوف الجماهير أؤدي واجبي معها كأي مواطن آخر.
Under heavy popular pressure, Nasser rescinded his decision to step down from the presidency. And attempts to regain the lost Arab territories began. Israel had tripled its size, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, eastern Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights.
We tried everything. We went to the United Nations, we tried mediations, we tried contacts with different countries. And it was clear that all this was to no avail.
The mood was, let's give nothing back if we don't have to. There were songs written, there were victory albums. There was a huge intoxication of victory. This huge, unique, miraculous victory of the Israeli army in that war was the greatest tragedy in the history of Israel.
The Israelis basked in an aura of invincibility. But their victory was just the start of even greater complications, which still plague the Middle East to this day. Israel found itself governing and being responsible for 1 million Palestinians in the newly occupied Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Jerusalem.
I took about 6 months to roam around the newly occupied territories, mostly in the West Bank and Gaza, and I came back and I said, look, there is another people there and they have a national movement. So what do? Either we conquer them and create a sort of an apartheid state, or we half the loaf into a predominantly Jewish state called Israel, and the West Bank and Gaza should be a basis for future negotiations, a recognition of their rights to have a state of their own, a viable state of their own in the West Bank and Gaza.
What Israel chose was, and still remains, the first option. In the aftermath of the war, Israel declared what it called the unification of Jerusalem. The entire holy city was placed under Israeli jurisdiction, including Christian and Muslim holy sites.
We are the government and the only government in the area. That is to say that we have obligations and privileges and duties there. Obligation and privilege to maintain law and order and to provide the people with services and with suitable standard of living as a government, like every government towards its citizen.
Furthermore, and in defiance of international law, Israeli settlers began to move into the West Bank, the territory they called Judea and Samaria.
The lands which they wanted to settle in were the core and heartland of the Jewish people in biblical times. This is where Judaism emerged. So it was natural that there would be this messianic urge to settle those areas. perhaps even clear out Arabs from these areas. This didn't happen, but Jewish settlements were placed there, and this has made things much more complicated for peacemaking here.
In addition to the West Bank, settlements were spreading in the Gaza Strip, Sinai, and on the Golan Heights. And as the Israelis tightened their grip on the occupied territories, it became clear they had no intention of returning them.
حالة الصلف الإسرائيلي تجاه أي محاولات لإبرام اتفاق سلام مع مصر بالذات والجوانب العربية المحيطة بيها ترجع أساساً إلى فكرة إنه العقل الإسرائيلي يتعامل دائماً مع كل المحيطين به وفقاً لمناطق القوة والضعف. فإذا كنت لا تمتلك أوراق ضغط ولا تمتلك مواطن قوة تمارسها ضده، هو لن يستجيب ليك ولن يعطيك أرض ولن يبرم معك اتفاق سلام.
In October 1973, after just 6 years, the Arabs, aiming to restore their territories and their dignity, would launch another war. Israel was about to receive a sharp reminder of the vulnerability it thought it had conquered forever in the War of June 1967.
Wow. Thank you, Zach. And
welcome.
Yeah. So, let me review briefly some of the lessons, basic lessons I've learned over the decades, in part from defeats like this. But one, all of the involuntary moving from my childhood on, you learn that one, the world is a very, very small place, and that there's a single world economy and society. To be sure, there are two social systems within it since 1917, one capitalism and the other the system created by socialist revolutions. They're unmistakably regulated by different laws, but they're operating within that single world economy and really world society, especially with the rise of the internet. But in addition, this world is massively unequal. In a few hours, we could all literally be in unspeakable, in places where there unspeakable things are happening, whether it's occupied Palestine or the Congo or Somalia or Myanmar, or right here in the United States, the overcrowded housing, the homeless camps and shelters, the prisons filling the United States. But still, one lesson is the world is a very, very small place. The second is that it's very changeable, and that change can happen very quickly. So something that I've had the advantage, quote unquote, of seeing or experiencing is qualitative changes taking place several times, whether it was Palestine or the Suez War or Civil War in Lebanon in '58, revolution in Lebanon in the '70s, defeat in Lebanon. A third lesson is the importance of the right of oppressed nations to self-determination and the two associated land tasks, and that these are more important and necessary than ever if, essentially, if we're going to complete the transition from capitalism to socialism and human liberation. So the national questions involve the right to self-determination. The two land tasks are, on the one hand, territory, if an oppressed nation chooses separation. And second, the expropriation of land from the landlords and from finance capital behind them, and placing it in the hands of those who will work it and protect it. And it's clear that there's going to be no solution to national tasks, no solution to the housing crisis that's plaguing now all capitalist countries, no solution to the environmental breakdown that's threatening humanity. So, the Soviet support for creating the Israeli state meant that communist parties would now be not only violating the right of an oppressed nation to self-determination, but it meant supporting taking land from the tiller. In other words, ripping the sickle from the hammer, our central symbol, and breaking the hammer in the process, as Jack Womack, a friend of the center, has put it. So, a fourth lesson is that the decisive organization for the future of humanity, either way, the decisive organization is the World Communist Movement, which was created by the greatest advance in all of human history, which was the Russian Revolution, which addressed national questions and the land questions, reinforced by all revolutions since 1917, including Albania, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Korea, China. So, let me tell you a little bit about my childhood. A bicycle figures in this story, so I might as well tell you about it. By the time I was 5 years old, my escape from home, and maybe more, was a bicycle. I had learned to ride by the time I was 5 and would bicycle all over Cairo. Because of that Soviet support for creating this apartheid state, essentially, Palestinians and Arab masses in general, we pinned our hopes on nationalism, particular pan-Arab nationalism, crossing across the colonial borders to encompass Arab speakers, and that included my father. So in mid-1952, a pan-Arab nationalist movement was gaining strength. The documentary touched on it within the Egyptian army, aimed against the British and their lackey, King Farouk. And my father enthusiastically supported this movement. My mother generally was very quiet. Well, on one of my bike rides in the early summer of 1952, I came across a demonstration in Cairo against the king and the British, and I joined it. So I wasn't quite 6 years old, and the police attacked the demonstration, and I think tear gas was lobbed at us. I escaped on my bicycle, basically unharmed, and that was my first demonstration. A few weeks later, Farouk was overthrown. Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power, and I remember my father taking us to one of the king's palaces, which Nasser had opened up to the public. And my childhood hero was no sports star. It was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of a pan-Arab nationalist movement. A minor memory, on one of my bike rides, I went by what was some rich person's estate that was fenced in. And in the middle of their garden, there was a large mango tree with mangoes on the grass. And I love mangoes, so I couldn't resist. And I jumped over the fence to collect mangoes. And the servants spied me, and they came out running, screaming, and I took off. And the servants were picking up the mangoes like rocks and throwing them at me. So for some reason, I still remember that. And then in November '56, end of October, as the documentary pointed out, Israeli, British, and French forces went to war. School was canceled. I was so happy about that. I hated school. And I was rooting for the defeat of the attackers. And there was an Egyptian military facility not far from our house in Cairo. And one day when the air raid sirens went off, I jumped on my bike to head to that, to see the action, and nearly got killed, not by British bombs, but by an Egyptian army truck that was speeding to the same army facility. And it just about hit me and blew me off my bicycle. So, and then in part because of US, Soviet, and Soviet opposition to the British, French, Israeli action, and in part the US was moving in against and taking over from the British and French. But as we saw, the aggressors had to withdraw. And now it looked like maybe pan-Arab nationalism really could resist imperialism. But very soon things started souring. We had a neighbor, Palestinian, who had been in the Communist Party, and he was disappeared by Egyptian forces. They picked him up in the middle of the night, and we never saw him again. And almost certainly he was executed. So because I had learned very early that, quote unquote, the communists had supported creating an Israeli state, I didn't feel bad for him, but neither did I forget that and wondered what was going on. Soon after that, the Egyptian government announced that all work permits for Palestinians were canceled. And so my father was out of a job, and we were forced to move to Lebanon. And relatives in the United States who had come from Syria began securing us refugee visas. So, but we went to Lebanon in time for civil war there, '58. Eisenhower sent in the Marines, and my father's ear was grazed by a bullet. We moved to the US, but he and my mother returned to Lebanon, and then they moved to Iran. And then came the '67 war, land grabbing war by a settler state. By then, imperialism had become the main funder and arms supplier to the Israeli state, often through the French or Germans and other junior partners of US crimes. But the US was funding quite a bit of it, and arranged, for example, say for Germany, West Germany, to do the same. So the defeat that pan-Arab nationalism suffered in 1967, as we saw, was sweeping. Nasser died within 3 years after that defeat. And as I'm sure you know, Palestinians called the defeat the Naksa, the second Nakba, the catastrophe, the setback. But it also entered into our thick Palestinian heads that nationalism could not engineer lasting victories. It was defeat after defeat, going back decades. And by comparison, we're looking at working class-led revolutions and their achievements, and the ability of China and People's Korea to repel US imperialism acting through the United Nations. By the way, Palestinians have a genetic hostility to the United Nations. I call it, along with Koreans in particular, meaning that there is no material basis for oppressors and oppressed of a world unite. And in any event, the members of the United Nations are not nations. The United States is the oppresses several nations, whether it's a black within its borders, the black nation, the Chicano, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. So, but the members of the United Nations, one, again, there's no basis for unity between oppressed and oppressors. But second, the membership are not nations. They're countries largely whose borders are largely determined by colonial. Bill Doris just added many native nations, certainly entitled to what Lenin and the Soviets developed, which was autonomous regions. Many of them are really tiny, often as a result of out-and-out genocide. So, in any event, we're looking at the ability of China and People's Korea to repel U.S. imperialism and crimes that are unspeakable in terms of what the U.S. did through the United Nations in Korea. We're looking at Vietnam's successful resistance against the first French and U.S. aggression. I spoke in Vietnam, I think, late 90s. The per capita income then was in the hundreds of dollars. The poverty, especially in the countryside, was unimaginable. And yet they effectively were able to drive out the United States, to be sure, with the aid of the Soviet Union and China. So, and we're looking at Cuba's amazing achievements, and they just stand out. So this terrible 1967 defeat led to a great return to Marxism and the role of the working class in leading the way to liberation among Palestinians. And this parallels similar developments, not least that of the Black Panther Party here in the United States. And on the wall in the Center for Marxist Education, before we had to shut down with the pandemic and the new landlord, there was a great picture of the entire leadership of the Black Panther Party at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, with Chu and Lai, and along with our own Richard Pendleton. So Marxism doesn't negate national liberation. On the contrary, it incorporates it together with that land question as a central task of the socialist revolution. So in the years after the 67 defeat, Marxism really became the language of Palestinian resistance. It was amazing how rapidly this happened. And the progress was so rapid that by 1970, the working class was in a good challenge for power in Jordan. The exploiters, domestic and international, drowned that challenge in blood. And the field of struggle shifted to Lebanon. And in 1976, the working class in Lebanon, essentially led by Palestinian Marxists who had learned in part from the, again, both from defeats like 1967, but also from the struggle in Jordan in 69-70, where my father's youngest brother was killed by the Israelis, with the Jordanian army telling the Israelis where he was. So he was part of that motion that I'm talking about. But in 1976, so the struggle shifts to Lebanon. In 1976, the working class in Lebanon, led by Palestinian Marxists, not only defeated the Lebanese army by splitting it along class lines, is extraordinary, but also defeated the Lebanese Phalange, open admirers of Hitler and named after Franco's forces. The Phalange was armed and trained by the Israelis, these open admirers of Hitler, with US support. And essentially, the working class in power in Lebanon turned to Soviet leaders for help. And this request was turned down. And it was the first time I thought the Soviet Union could fall. And the revolution was drowned in blood. And what has followed has been the rise of religious movements and fundamentalists in one form or another, often representing essentially petty bourgeois resistance, ultimately to imperialism's depredations, including theft of land. But also what followed was the defeat of revolution in Iran in 79-80. Many people don't realize, but Iranian workers formed Soviets called Shuras, seized the factories, oil fields, oil refineries, and formed Soviets. Again, no help from the Soviet Union. That really proved crucial, in my opinion, in bringing down the Soviet Union. There was a million other factors, and I have spent much of the past 30 years putting together essentially, and really, I think, solving just in the past year what led to the fall of the Soviet Union. But that defeat of the Iranian Revolution, which facilitated effectively, led to the Soviet Union getting caught up in the Afghan trap, with Iran collaborating with the United States and essentially other reactionary forces in terms of almost ripping the Soviet army apart. So, again, it's essential to face these facts, figure out how these errors, as serious as the error on Palestine, could be made in order to essentially advance human liberation. And really the summary is workers of the world unite, and the first step is communist parties of the world unite consciously. And I learned that from leaders in China who invited me and have put up with me for 20-some years, in part to avoid China suffering a repeat of the Soviet Union. So, so thanks, and we should open it up. And Zach, it's yours.
Okay, I guess I'll go with the first question. A lot of Arabs and Palestinians I've encountered have a very defeatist attitude towards Marxism. Like they've either flirted with Marxism, but like have moved to supporting, like there are a couple Lebanese former Marxists I knew who now support Hezbollah and engage in like open Holocaust denial. And then there's some that have moved in the direction of Trotskyism. Like what needs to happen for the Palestinian Marxist-Leninist movement to regain its strength?
Good question. Essentially, it's been almost 50 years since the last time the working class has taken power, which was in Southeast Asia in 1975. Laos, the development of the People's Republic of Laos is the last time, December 1975. And in the meantime, this huge dam has built up all of these defeats and so on. And any one victory would, essentially quite a dam would break. And the huge question then is the ability to organize the just massive anger of the, masses to complete the transition. So any victory of a socialist revolution, it's not the Venezuela is still capitalist. Nicaragua is still capitalist. So any one retaking will break a dam, but a lot of it involves identifying how these errors could be made. And my quickest summary, essentially, shortest summary of what was behind the fall of the Soviet Union, or for that matter, the defeat of revolution in Lebanon in 76 or in Iran in 79. What was behind that are first weaknesses in Marxism in the world communist movement created by the Russian Revolution, which amazingly, it's largely grouped around what's called SolidNet, Solidarity Network, which convenes an annual meeting of communist workers' parties. Despite the fall of the Soviet Union, this world movement has 110 million members of communist parties. And the unions affiliated with these parties have 420 million workers in them. So despite the fall of the Soviet Union, so part of it is essentially going back to the central reference point of the world communist movement, which is 1917, reinforced by subsequent revolutions. The other is moving SolidNet from essentially meanings for exchange of information to meanings and an organization that follows up with action. But again, understanding that what's behind this fall of the Soviet Union and its historic roots, and that's almost for another full discussion, but this is crucial. So, but it's very possible, for example, that this war in Ukraine accelerates the development. It at least appears to me that the weak link in the imperialist chain is Russia again. What Lenin identified as a weak link in 1917, Russia and Ukraine, both, they have a great revolutionary tradition behind them. And they have significant communist forces inside them. So they're still suffering from the confusion that follows defeats. But I would say that's what we'll take. And in the meantime, what you're describing, Zach, in terms of, false consciousness, even reactionary consciousness among Palestinians, well, that's a result of sweeping defeats like 1970 and 1976. And it's not pretty. And, again, the language of Marxism with its historical depth and understanding about liberation of oppressed nations and the land question, as well as the working classes' own tasks, that's gone. That's by and large not there. So, but the lessons can be relearned certainly much faster than what it took to build the Soviet economy, or for that matter, the Chinese economy. So.
Okay, Bill has his hand up, and then Yusuf.
Thank you, Wadi'h, and thank you for the film, which brought back horrible memories as well. That time of, I was like 13, at the time of Zionist triumphalism, and was so horrible. I also, even at that age, I was rooting for Nasser for Egypt, the Palestinians, being native. But the one thing with Nasser, with all the failings of a bourgeois nationalist, he still was very clear that Israel was a tool of U.S. imperialism, which is something I'm still seeing today, the babyish idea that Israel controls the United States and that somehow the US is somehow acting against its own interests. When we know that all over the world, every war the US wages is for supporting tyrants, is for profit, but somehow the Middle East is some kind of Bermuda Triangle where these laws don't apply. But nothing is more clear an example than the 1967 war, where actually the struggle between Israel, the Zionist state, and the Arab states before that had taken a second place to the sort of a civil war in the Arab world between nationalist, mostly bourgeois nationalists, and royalist US-backed forces, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, and so on. There was actually a war going on in Yemen. And Israel's attack on Egypt and Syria, and Jordan too, which actually probably ironically saved King Hussein's throne, shifted the balance by economically devastating Egypt in particular, closing the Suez Canal. It shifted the balance, at least temporarily, to the royalist pro-US forces. Egypt was basically forced into Saudi receivership. And it didn't stop the struggle, because you had the Libyan revolution, you had the Iraqi nationalization, the world momentum, and most important, the rise of the Palestinian resistance. But just a concrete example, with the closing of the Suez Canal, the Shah had been put on the throne in Iran by the CIA 14 years earlier in return for turning much of Iran's oil reserves over to the US. And so then they built a pipeline through occupied Palestine, bringing US-owned Iranian oil to Europe, while the prices soared. That ended with the 1979 revolution. But the real prize then, the price of reopening the Suez Canal, was Egypt joining the US camp, breaking ties with the USSR, and the so-called Intifada, where they opened the Egyptian economy. And without these developments, it's probable that Nixon would not have been able to take the dollar off the gold standard in 1970s, 173. Egypt joining Camp David and becoming US receivership, that not only allowed Israel to attack Lebanon in 82, it really allowed the Iraqi war against Iran, which was really heavily armed and backed by Egypt and the Saudis. Egyptian troops poured over there and armed. Just so many ways that this was a bonanza for the US ruling class. I was involved in the Viva Palestina convoy, medical aid convoy to Gaza in 2009. And I remember just seeing the big ads, the Coca-Cola ads all over Cairo of Mubarak drinking Coke that was bottled in Israeli occupied Palestine. Anyway. So.
Just one note about the Iraqi US really imperialist support for the Iraqi attack on Iran, 1980. One of the bloodiest wars since World War II. If Mark is still on, he can attest to that in terms of the casualties. What was that about? Well, as I mentioned, workers in Iran had formed Soviets, and with the Iranian Revolution, and the clergy was unable to break them up. And so the US supported Iraqi attack. And we know Saddam Hussein was on the US payroll going back, more than a decade. But that Iraqi attack on Iran, its main purpose was to break up the Soviets, that working class power that the clergy had been unable to break up. The 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the massacres at the refugee camps just by the airport, Sabra and Shatil. As I mentioned, the working class had risen to a position of power in Lebanon, and the US arranged, after the Soviets refused to defend that revolution, which would have created a Cuba in the Middle East, except that Lebanon is no island, and revolution would have quickly spread, in my opinion, almost immediately into Syria and very possibly into Turkey, NATO country, and also lit the fires of socialist revolution in Iran. Well, the Syrian army, riding on Soviet tanks and trained by Soviets, came in to Lebanon to essentially discipline the working class, the social democratic regime, mildly social democratic regime. And they did quite a job, but this was no fascist force, and they did not smash the working class organizations. They did quite a bit of damage, but didn't smash them. Well, in Sabra and Shatil in particular, working class, by 1981-82, you have rebuilding of the working class movement, in particular out of those camps. And that's what the Israeli invasion was above all about. And you see the Syrian army giving token opposition by allowing the Israelis to finish the class job that the Syrians had started but hadn't finished. So again, you see the lawful operation of class struggle, but against the interests of the working class, without a working class leadership able to guide, despite these tremendous achievements, whether in Lebanon or Iran. So I think it's useful to see it that way. And our host, Zach, I think will be doing research on the Iranian Revolution, and hopefully can bring out much more detail about that and the Iraqi invasion. But,
Okay, Yusuf?
Yes, thank you very much. Fairly good film and a great comments. I'd like you to elaborate more on which Bill mentioned, that the Egyptian army was essentially tied up in Yemen, fighting the Saudis on the eve of the '67 war. And maybe you could elaborate on that. I sort of disagree with you about the United Nations. United Nations is not a world government. It wasn't designed to be a world government. It's merely a diplomatic forum. So it really becomes what the constituent entities make it to be. And I think the Soviet Union could be criticized for being overly cautious, but and giving concessions. But the purpose of the United Nations was really one to sort of put the seal on the Allied victory over the Axis over Hitler. And two, to prevent World War III, because Churchill and there was considerable movement within the so-called Western camp, imperialist camp, to go from Berlin to Moscow. So the United Nations is what you make it out to be. It's not a world government. So I don't think that the participation of the Soviet Union per se is wrong, because, well, that's just, as I said, it has limited goals. But I agree with you that the Soviet Union was overly cautious, afraid, and gave too much concessions to the, including reversing its opposition to the formation of Israel, and also concessions in Iran, Greece, and elsewhere. So that's my comments, and I await your response. As I said, the question is, could you elaborate more on the involvement of the Egyptian forces being tied down in Yemen?
Right. I have to admit, I'm not that familiar with that involvement in Yemen. What I do know is that with the defeat in '67, that sweeping defeat and determination that even as sincere a nationalism as Gamal Abdel Nasser's was, that it could not achieve victories, but on the contrary, engineered the defeats. And what followed is one of the most unknown chapters, but very similar to what happened with the Palestinian movement or the Black Panther Party in Yemen, which was development of Marxism and the working class taking power in Yemen in 1969, just 2 years later, as a result of the inability of even strong nationalism to solve fundamental problems and to resist imperialism. So very few people are aware, but the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen was a Cuba in the Arabian Peninsula, a very weak one, in part because the working class was so small, and the failure of revolution, socialist revolution, first in Jordan the next year, and then in Lebanon, left it that much more isolated. It got remarkable support, especially from the German Democratic Republic, but still not enough. And it went down along with the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia and Albania. So it's part of the 12 counter-revolutions that swept across. So, and again, a big part of it was the realization among the best of the Yemeni resistance fighters in terms of that the only way out was that the road taken by Vietnam, by Korea, by China. So, about the United Nations. So first, again, let's make it clear, there's no material basis for unity between oppressors and oppressed. And believe me, world capitalism, Woodrow Wilson attempted to lure Lenin into the United Nations predecessor, the League of Nations. And even though the Soviet Union was in an infinitely weaker position at the time than the Soviet Union was after World War II, despite the terrible losses that it suffered, but Lenin turned down the request to join the League of Nations and called it a den of thieves. And I agree about that. And that was his term. So think in one of his presentations, Mark Albertson pointed out that somehow with under Truman came the national security advisor, the rise essentially of one person, essentially, or some kind of centralization had taken place by effectively bypassing elected the oversight of Congress, effectively to wage war. So what happened? And this is so important, and it was a subject of an earlier CME discussion about the tremendous centralization of capital, and that effectively a single group that before the rise of Roosevelt to president, two groups were dominant in U.S. capital, the Morgans and the Rockefellers. Lenin identifies them correctly in the imperialism, and this is consistent. The key to understand is that Roosevelt served the interests of one of those groups, the Rockefellers. And we had another documentary of the American Liberty League, which represented an effort, out and out documented, by the Morgans to wage a coup against Roosevelt, to throw him out. And they made the mistake. I mean, Morgan sent one of his servants, DuPont, to Europe to learn how Hitler and Mussolini organized veterans to carry out essentially their coups. And DuPont comes back, and they made the mistake of going to the most decorated Marine general at the time, Smedley Butler, to carry it out. Well, Smedley Butler turned them in, and effectively that was a good excuse for Roosevelt, if anything, and the Rockefeller group behind it, essentially to systematically cut Morgan down to size, which happened. But it means now that one group, really one extended family, but it's really one group, is dominating not only all of capital in the United States, but the state apparatus. So there's what that national security advisor comes from, and so much other centralization. And so then, in fact, there's a hidden royalty in the United States, unelected royalty. And its main think tank, I sometimes call it the Central Committee of a U.S. ruling class, is the Council on Foreign Relations. And that's where Bretton Woods comes from, the Bretton Woods institutions, not only the World Bank and the IMF, but the United Nations. And as all of us probably should know, the Rockefellers donated that land that the UN stands on. And of course, it had a very heavy ideological basis. So yes, there is reason for, say, a Soviet government to participate in bodies, say, to regulate air traffic. You need that. That's justified. But for communist parties to be involved, to be part of what Lenin correctly denounced as a den of thieves, that's inexcusable. And in particular, it's under conditions where we just had the victory of revolutions in Albania, Yugoslavia, 1945, in northern Vietnam in 1945, end of August, in Korea, 48, and the Chinese Revolution. And in the Chinese in particular were trying to rebuild international communist unity to advance human liberation. And the Soviets turned that down in favor of the United Nations. So in a sense, to see it that way. But again, for some reason, Palestinians and North Koreans in particular have some kind of genetic dislike of the United Nations. And maybe, you know, it's just that.
All right, Samia is next.
Okay, thank you, Wadi'h. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to start with a few quick, brief, subjective, emotional, experiential comments, and then I have a big question. And first of all, that film gives me the creeps. I look at it and I see total propaganda. And I would love to see it torn apart and put back together factually by a future working class authority that has all the information. One comment is I had friends, and particularly one who was a soldier in the Syrian army, and he used to tell me stories of how they crossed the border and how much they could do and how much their officers stopped them and how you know, he described what they could have done, but they infiltrated nevertheless. This is not popular resistance infiltrators that are Palestinians. These are Syrian soldiers armed and uniformed who went into the territory. And he described to me all he could do. He eventually came to the US and lived here and returned to Syria for a visit to his family and immediately got imprisoned and put in jail. Just to confirm what a little bit of what was being said in the film, the Syrian leadership and government and military leadership included was blind to the will and the wishes of the soldiers, or let's put it that way, of the working class soldiers who were the foot soldiers who knew much better and could have accomplished amazing things. I don't know what else I was going to, oh, yes, the UN. I definitely hate the UN. If anybody needs confirmation, I cannot tell you in everything I read that they've ever written about Palestine, from the very beginning, they were against us. It was clear. Give you a tiny, tiny example. When they created the refugee camps, they rented the land for 100 years. 100 years, mind you. So they were not planning to solve any issue for us. They were part of planning how to destroy us. So yes, you know, United Nations, you demolish it first of all on revolution. That's number one on my agenda if I could do it. Now for the question, you know, one of the most hopeful things I heard, or I, you know, Wadi'h, that you talked about, was to remind us, and I'm not a CP member, nor am I a member of anything right now, so maybe I should feel guilty, but I don't, to remind us that the CP is one international party, that the US CP is a section of an international, not an independent. So my question is, what is the responsibility of the internationalism of the CPs of the world towards Palestine now that things have become so difficult for the Palestinians in general, for the Palestinian refugees, for the Palestinian workers? Just a little question, you know, reversing the responsibility. What can be done to help lift the Palestinian left and Marxists into a more enthusiastic, a little support, a word, a recognition, a condemnation of Israel, describing Israel as to what it really is, an encampment, a military encampment of the US. Maybe it has a state, but definitely historically and in every form, it just cannot exist in the future. Its future is tied completely to capitalism. Anyway, sorry for going on a little long, but the main question, an important question, is what can the International Communist Party with all of its sections do for Palestine right now to help?
Let me start with that. Break the embargo on Gaza, break that's number one, is to break this inhuman, engineered genocide, where every calorie that's available to Palestinians is counted, and it's set on in a way, the population is getting poisoned in every way. If only the poisoning of the water through deliberate destruction of water treatment plants and sewage, but also the seepage of salt water itself terribly polluted from the Mediterranean. But in addition, again, the allotment of food and often destruction of what little agriculture is left in Wadi'h is, so in my mind, effectively, the move to just break this Israeli strangling from the air, the sea, and the land of Wadi'h would be a huge step forward. Imperialism has created such a mess in Palestine that I've sometimes half joked with my hosts in China in particular that resolving it is going to take the combined thinking and efforts of half of the population of China. And then I correct myself, half of the membership of the Communist Party in China. That would be 48 million people. 96 million in that Chinese party, which, by the way, is extraordinarily disciplined and well organized. The huge question for now is for what? So right now it's mainly to build the economy and try to maintain the world status quo. That's not going to work, essentially, as all of these problems keep mounting. But how to resolve this mess? But I would say a big step is breaking, the Israeli chokehold on Gaza, but the right to return, the right to land, but there's so much more to it. So there's been a Palestinian expression of the right to self-determination. It's from 1969. And by vote of the Palestine National Council after considerable discussion, and the vote was no to two-state. The vote was for a secular democratic Palestine. But 43 years have passed. Again, it's absolutely daunting. My summary sometimes of what's unfolding is that worldwide, it makes struggle and revolution more necessary, but also more difficult. But essentially, between them, the communist parties have both the guidance of Marxism and some extraordinary organizational, educational, military know-how to overcome the challenges that exist and the existential threats that we face from war, from environment, and social disintegration can be a powerful force to complete the liberation. But it's going to take this essentially rebuilding that conscious unity that I was talking about. So major, this is, very, very difficult. So with the UN, again, Yusuf, just something to keep in mind, maybe he's gotten off, is one of the first things the United Nations did was to facilitate the creation of the Israeli state. And in fact, the indications are that essentially, as part of the negotiations to forming the United Nations, the U.S. made it a condition for the Soviets to join the United Nations was to support creation of the Israeli state, and apparently they did that. And so that appears to be around August 1949, and they kept it secret, violating a Leninist dictum against such kind of secret diplomacy. And the second big thing that the United Nations did was to facilitate the attack on the Korean and Chinese revolutions, again, which was on the scale of crimes against Korea that remain unspeakable. And if we want to understand, part of the some of the particular features of the People's Korea is what the U.S. through the United Nations. Those were blue helmets, supposedly carrying out this bombing. MacArthur wore a blue helmet. And it just goes on, and it has set the stage, for where we are now in terms of delaying revolution. So again, we have to see the Soviets joining the UN as opposed to essentially joining with and the great momentum of the Chinese Revolution and revolutions in Korea and Vietnam in terms of rebuilding the world movement. So again, this gives you an idea of the work I've been doing in China over the past 20-some years in terms of rebuilding, understanding what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union and to avoid a repeat and to move forward. So, again, there's need for certain coordinating bodies for shipping, for health. But, look at the World Health Organization. It's powerless against patents. It's powerless against these pandemics. This goes on and on with every organization. It's been powerless, essentially. About the power that it's had is to perpetuate the organization of the world along the colonial lines established in the past 200 years or so. So just to give you a sense, 2,000 languages are spoken in Africa. And yet it's divided up along colonial lines that are just devastating to the liberation of Africa. So a huge topic in itself. I think we've worn out our welcome here.
All right, thank you, everyone. If you can, please donate through our website to keep our operations going. Important as always. And thank you, Wadi'h, for this wonderful talk. And I hope to see everyone again soon.
Yes, we have some good events coming up, and announcements will be forthcoming soon. And we have more youth involvement coming up. So look for us. And thank you, everybody, and for all of your contributions. And Alvin, it's wonderful seeing you at the pyramids, and where I used to go often on weekends. And great memory. Again, this is just 20-some minutes from Cairo, but one of the great memories was going to a village, 20 minutes from our house, 10 minutes from the pyramids. And it's as if we had just gone back several hundred years with mud houses. And what I'll never forget was there was an ox tied to a wooden wheel, so going round and round. And what was bringing up was the bucket of water from a water well. and again, minutes from Cairo. And what were they growing in the village? Sugar cane, probably the single most poisonous crop that humanity has ever developed, and essentially used to enslave populations, literally and through addiction to sugar. So there's Alvin in Egypt. Let's see the top of that pyramid. So I wish you had a picture of the Sphinx, because we used to go and there's a nick on the Sphinx's nose, and we were told that it was Napoleon's troops that had broken the nose. And so I checked with a friend who'd been in Egypt recently, and sure enough, Napoleon's troops used it for target practice. And it turns out that's not the only place where they where they attacked monuments for target practice. So thanks everybody, and see you soon again, I hope.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone.